Yo, what's up, y'all? So today we're gonna go over the top 5 hardest bosses in Black Myth Wukong after I finish the game. The game is absolutely incredible, and a review is gonna come out soonish, probably next few days or so. And today we're gonna go over the top 5 hardest bosses in Black Myth Wukong the entire game. Okay, so let's just get into it. So first off, number 5. Okay, so the number 5 bosses, in my opinion, is the final boss of the game, the Grey Sage's Empty Husk, I believe that was the name. So this boss is interesting because he negates everything that you can do. He negates everything, every little fancy tricks that you do, and you don't really have a lot of options against him. So whenever you try to use a spell, he breaks your immobilize quite reliably. He does every counter when you try to open on him. He does perfect dodges and leave vengeful mirages. And he also almost always parries you perfectly if you get greedy. So this boss, even though he does a lot of cool tricks and he counter a lot of stuff that you do, it is still a pretty straightforward boss. The reason I say that is he only has one trick. A very simple and easy way to defeat him is every time he does a combo, you simply do the perfect dodges of his attacks, and then you have a very limited window to attack him. There's nothing else going on. If you rinse and repeat this process, you'll eventually be able to beat him quite reliably. So that's why the final boss, the Grey Sage's Empty Husk, is placed at number 5. So at number 4, in my opinion, that I will give this place to the GoldenEye Beast. This is a secret boss in Chapter 5. You'll have to backtrack a little bit after you've gone through the rolling ball phase and beating all the 5 caskets, and you'll be able to unlock the Bishu Beast Cave, where you will get actually the very valuable upgrade materials and crafting materials for your Bull King armor. For this boss, the reason I place him above the Grey Sage is that this is the only boss that spams ability non-stop. He does not have any window in which he sits still. Every time he finishes a combo, he just picks up right after with another combo. And he does a lot of AoE attacks, he leaves a lot of ground effects, so you really have to be kitted out to beat this boss, and you really have to be super aware and find the precious windows that almost never exist while fighting this boss. And this is why this boss is placed above the Grey Sage at number 4. Alright, so at number 3, we have the final boss of Chapter 4. Now, this boss has 2 phases. The first phase is not particularly difficult. The only problem with it is that it can be hard to hit sometimes, and he is susceptible to almost all of your spells, and he doesn't really do that much damage to begin with. However, the real difficult part about this boss is phase 2. There's a lot of tricky mechanics in phase 2 that requires different type of strategies to avoid. For example, when he leaps into the air and his eyes start shooting at you, you need to run around with stamina and sprint in order to fully avoid it. Dodging will not help you here because the timing of those eye beams will basically guarantee to hit you if you try to dodge them. And there are other attacks. For example, he does a flaming breath that is very damaging, even though it is very easy to avoid. If you make a mistake and get hit by it, it most likely will set you on fire, and without any fire resistance, fire does do a lot of damage to you. Furthermore, this boss does a lot of AoE attacks that basically one-shots you if you're not full HP, and that is why this boss is very punishing in phase 2, is that you're not really allowed to make more than one mistake at times. That's why this boss is placed above the Golden Beast at number 3. Now moving on next, which might be a contentious pick, but in my opinion, if you fight this boss at appropriate level, if you don't skip and gear up and come back to fight him again later down the line, this is the most Souls-like boss that I've felt in this entire game. And this boss is none other than the last Long, the Yellow Long. The reason I say this is not because of all of his moves that are particularly tricky. he does do mix up and he does change up his moveset depending on his remaining health. At the very beginning, he often does one set of combos, but at the later end of it, when he's below 30 or 50% HP, he follows up with his first combo with two additional combos that does astronomical damages. And the reason I say he's the most Souls-like bosses is that he is the most punishing boss that I've ever fought in this entire game. Even though his moveset is not particularly fancy, and once you learn his moves, it's fairly easy to avoid, every single mistake will almost surely cost you your life. And that reminds me a lot of the Souls game, where a single mistake will usually means your death, unless you find a way to choose the boss. And this is why I placed this boss above all others except for one, simply because every single move of his is incredibly punishing, and if you make a single mistake, you're most likely just dead, and that feels very Souls-like. And that's why the Yellow Long is placed at number 2 on the top 5 hardest bosses list. Now, before I move on to the final pick and the top 1, the hardest boss in this entire game, I want to give some honorable mentions, first of which is the Wandering White, the baby head boss, who I would like to call the gatekeeper of this game. The reason that this is the gatekeeper is that you encounter him very early, even though you don't have to fight him. A lot of people will choose to engage with him while severely underleveled, and you'll have a very hard time. But this is an excellent boss to break you into the game, to force you to learn and understand the mechanics of the game and how they work together in order to beat. Although this is not a technically very difficult boss, especially when you get into later in the game. If you come back and fight him, you will most likely one-shot this boss. He is not technically very challenging, but he is still a very challenging boss at the beginning of the game, and he is, in my opinion, the perfect boss to break you into the gameplay of the game. That's why I want to give this boss, the baby head, an honorable mention. Now, the second honorable mention might be a boss that you all are familiar with, and might be a boss that you think should be on this top 5 list, and that is the Ink Tiger in the Painting Realm. Now, I've seen a lot of people struggle with this boss, but when I fought it, it took me all about 4 tries to beat him. And to me, his moveset is really pretty simple. His attacks are very well telegraphed, even though he does a fair amount of combos, and the dodge timing is very clear and crisp. And once you learn all of his moves, you'll most likely be able to beat him quite readily. Then the reason why this boss is very hard when you first encounter him is that the old tricks that you used to do no longer works. He does not react to your immobilize. He almost always have a counter to your hard heavies. He does quite a bit of mix-ups, and he does a lot of stuns, and he has a disappearance axe that almost dodges all of your moves. So even though this boss might be very challenging when you first encounter him, I don't consider the Ink Tiger to be a particularly challenging boss because how straightforward and how well telegraphed his moves are. The only reason that people won't have a hard time with him is because he has a lot of counters to the usual movesets that you pretty much always rely on fighting other bosses. So it does take people a while to actually adapt to the playstyle that's suited to beat this boss. At long last, the number 1 spot for the hardest boss in this entire game is no other than the boss that you fight in the very prologue, but this time you have to beat the game in order to fight him. And that boss is Erlon. Now, Erlon is, without a question, the hardest boss in this entire game. He has, if I'm not mistaken, double the amount of movesets of any other bosses. He has so many different combos and mix-up, and he can switch it up depending on your counters to his moveset. He has a lot of starters that transition into different combos, and he does so much damage even at the very end of the game where you get the best armor there are. It is incredibly punishing for some of his combos, and most arguably the ones that does Red Lightning will almost always one-shot you even with the best armor in the game if you're not at full HP. And on top of that, he also inherits a lot of the tricks from the final boss of the game, the Grey Sage, in that he has a lot of counters to everything you do. Specifically speaking, he is always immune to your immobilized spell, and he will always dodge a charged heavy attack while he's not stuck in his attack animation. On top of that, he is the only boss in the entire game that has a posture bar. And this posture bar basically prevents you from spamming him with light and heavy to keep him in a staggered state, and basically negate that kind of aggressive strategy of keeping the boss under stagger and just lay into them. So with all that being said, Erlon is without a single question the hardest boss in this entire game. Now that's it, folks. That's the top 5 hardest boss in this entire game. If you like this video, subscribe and like the video, and I'll see you next one.